"This medieval fire pit," she announced, her voice slicing through the crisp autumn air with the grating authority of a rusty hinge, "is not only a Class 4 aesthetic violation, it's an unapproved commercial enterprise, a noise pollutant, a fire hazard, and a direct affront to the modern, streamlined lifestyle we cultivate here at Summit Creek Estates." I stood there, sweat cooling on my brow, the heavy forging hammer still held loosely in my right hand, and just stared at the woman who had materialized at the edge of my open workshop. She was a caricature of suburban power, a plus-size woman named Karen squeezed into a beige pantsuit, clutching a clipboard to her chest like a holy shield. Her eyes, small and hard, scanned my forge, the anvil that had been my grandfather's, the carefully organized racks of steel, the glowing heart of the propane furnace, with a disgust usually reserved for roadkill. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on her clipboard. "The fines start today, Mr. Caldwell. $200 per day for the unauthorized structure, another $100 for the commercial activity, and we're issuing a special assessment of $500 for the immediate fire risk you pose to the community. Pay up, or the next letter you get will be from our attorneys about a lien on your property. Shut it down. Now." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of it left me speechless for a beat, the rhythmic clang of my work suddenly replaced by a ringing in my ears. This forge wasn't just my hobby, it was my therapy, the one place where the noise of the world and the echoes of my past fell away, replaced by the honest conversation between fire, steel, and muscle. It was my peace, and this woman was trying to bulldoze it with a clipboard and a condescending smirk. If you've ever had a run-in with an HOA president who thinks they're the queen of a tiny beige kingdom, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, or better yet, share your own HOA nightmare story. We've all got them, and it's time we started sharing them. Now back to how I dealt with Queen Karen of Summit Creek. You see, what Karen didn't know, what she couldn't possibly comprehend in her narrow world of bylaws and beige, was that my connection to this community ran deeper and was forged in hotter fires than her petty regulations. She loved to posture in the community newsletter, posing proudly by the magnificent wrought iron gates that stood at the entrance to our prestigious neighborhood. Gates adorned with intricate scrollwork of oak leaves and acorns, a symbol of the area's natural beauty. What she failed to realize was that the very hands she was now trying to bind in red tape were the same hands that had hammered those leaves and twisted those scrolls into existence. I was the blacksmith who had made them, and she had just declared war on the one man who knew how to dismantle her kingdom, one piece of carefully crafted iron at a time. My journey to Summit Creek Estates had been a long one, paved with the dust of deserts I never wanted to see and the ghosts of friends I'd never see again. After 15 years in the Army, most of it in special operations, coming home felt less like a return and more like a foreign deployment. The world was too quiet and too loud all at once. My wife, Sarah, a rock who had weathered my absences with more grace than I deserved, found this place. It was a new development, advertised as a peaceful retreat, a place to raise our 7-year-old daughter, Lily, surrounded by nature and good schools. We weren't HOA people, not by a long shot. The very idea of someone telling me what color I could paint my door felt like a violation of basic principles I'd fought for. But the developer had been smart. The rules, he'd assured us, were minimal, mostly concerning lawn care and trash can visibility, designed simply to protect property values. And there was a clause, Section 7, Paragraph C, that specifically allowed for detached hobbyist workshops and art studios, provided they met local building and safety codes. My forge, a custom-built structure at the far end of our 2-acre lot, didn't just meet them, it exceeded them. I had spent 6 months and a significant chunk of my savings designing and building it. It was my sanctuary, soundproofed, with a ventilation system that could clear a smoke-filled room in 30 seconds, and a fire suppression setup that would make a fire marshal weep with joy. Before we even closed on the house, I had submitted my plans for the workshop to the Architectural Review Committee, which at the time was still run by the developer. They were approved in writing, a document I now kept in a fireproof safe. The irony was, the developer himself had commissioned me to build the main gates for the entire development. He'd seen my portfolio online, loved my work, and wanted something unique, a statement piece that said, "Quality in permanence." I spent 3 months on those gates, pouring my soul into the steel, each hammer blow a prayer for the new life I was trying to build. They were without a doubt the best work I had ever done. We moved in, and for a year, life was exactly what we'd hoped for. Peaceful. I'd wake up, get Lily off to school, and spend my days in the forge, filling commissions for custom railings, fireplace screens, and sculptures. It wasn't a commercial enterprise in the way Karen imagined. It was a one-man artistic endeavor, my sole source of income. Yes, but quiet and contained. The neighbors on either side, a retired couple and a young family, had never once complained. In fact, Mr. Henderson from next door often came over with a cold drink just to watch me work, fascinated by the process. Then 6 months ago, the developer handed control of the HOA over to the residents. And that's when Karen, who had lived here for all of 2 years and distinguished herself only by complaining about the font on the street signs, seized power. Her campaign was a masterclass in fear-mongering about declining property values and the element that unmowed lawns might attract. She won the presidency with a minority of votes in a low-turnout election and immediately began her reign of terror. Her first act was to rewrite the violation code, adding dozens of vague, subjective rules about aesthetic harmony and community decorum. That was the document she was waving in my face now, a weapon she had forged herself, and she was aiming it right at the heart of my life. After she strutted away, leaving a trail of fines and threats in her wake, I walked back into the forge. The piece of steel I'd been working on, a delicate vine for a garden trellis, was cooling on the anvil. I looked at my hands, calloused and stained with the honest dirt of my trade. This wasn't just an attack on my livelihood. It was an attack on my identity, on the very idea that a man could build a quiet, honorable life with his own 2 hands. Karen had picked a fight with a soldier, a craftsman, a father. She thought she was enforcing a rule. What she was really doing was striking a match, and she had no idea how much fuel I had or how hot the fire was about to get. The first letter arrived 2 days later, a crisp white envelope with the Summit Creek Estates logo embossed in an offensively cheerful shade of green. It was a formal reiteration of Karen's verbal assault, typed up and signed with a flourish that screamed self-importance. The fines were all there, itemized like a bill from a mobster. $200 for unauthorized outbuilding, a blatant falsehood given my pre-approved plans. $100 for prohibited commercial activity, despite the bylaw allowing for home-based work that didn't impact the neighborhood. And the ludicrous $500 special fire risk assessment, a fee she had seemingly invented on the spot. Total due, $800 with a note at the bottom that the fines were cumulative and would accrue daily. My first instinct was the one hammered into me during years of training. Meet aggression with overwhelming force. I wanted to march down to her house, slam that letter on her door, and explain in very clear, concise terms the fundamental errors in her thinking. But that was the old me, the me who solved problems with direct action. The new me, the one Sarah and Lily needed, had to be smarter. This was a different kind of battlefield, one governed by paper and procedure. So I declared my own kind of war, a paper war. I went to my office, a small room overlooking the backyard and my forge, and cleared the desk. On the left, I placed Karen's letter. On the right, I placed a thick binder labeled Summit Creek Estates Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. For the next 3 hours, I read that document from cover to cover, not just reading, but studying it like an enemy's battle plan. I highlighted every word, every phrase, every comma that could be turned to my advantage. I found the section on hobbyist workshops and highlighted the developer's approval. I cross-referenced the definition of commercial activity, which was vaguely worded but clearly aimed at things like running a daycare or an auto repair shop with cars lining the street, not a quiet, contained art studio. Most importantly, I studied the section on how fines could be levied and appealed. It turned out, for a fine to be official, it had to be approved by a majority vote of the 5-person HOA board at a scheduled meeting. Karen, in her haste to assert dominance, had skipped that part. She had acted unilaterally, a queen issuing a decree without the consent of her court. That was her first mistake. I began to assemble my counteroffensive. I pulled out the original architectural plans for my forge, the signed approval letter from the developer's ARC, and the fire marshal's final inspection report, which gave the structure a stellar rating. I took high-resolution, time-stamped photographs of my workshop from every angle, showing its clean, orderly state and its distance from any neighboring property. I even set up a certified decibel meter and recorded the sound levels from my property line while I was working. The ambient noise of birds and distant traffic was louder than the muffled, rhythmic tapping from my forge. I compiled everything into a thick, meticulously organized binder of my own. My response to the HOA was not going to be an angry letter. It was going to be an evidence locker. Sarah came in later that evening, her face etched with worry. She'd seen the letter in the mail. "What are we going to do, Jack?" she asked, her hand resting on my shoulder. "She can't just do this, can she?" I turned and showed her my work, the stacks of documents, the highlighted bylaws. "No, she can't," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "She's a bully who has mistaken her little bit of power for absolute authority. She's overconfident and she's sloppy. We're not going to fight her on her terms. We're not going to get into a shouting match. We're going to follow the procedure, to the letter." The next day, I drafted my official response. It was polite, professional, and utterly damning. I addressed it to the entire HOA board, not just Karen. I formally disputed each fine, citing the specific bylaw or document that proved it was invalid. I attached copies of the approved plans, the fire inspection, the sound level readings, and the relevant pages of the CC and RS with my own annotations. I concluded by formally requesting a hearing before the full board to present my case, as was my right under the bylaws. I sent it via certified mail, requiring a signature so there would be an undeniable record of their receipt. This wasn't just a response, it was a shot across the bow. I was letting them know that I was not an easy target. I had read the rules, I had the evidence, and I was prepared. The ball was now in their court. I knew Karen wouldn't back down. Her ego wouldn't allow it. She would have to escalate, and when she did, I would be ready, with another binder, another piece of evidence, another procedural trap. She thought this was a sprint, a quick show of force to make me heal. She had no idea I was a marathon runner, and I had all the patience in the world. The forge remained quiet for now, not because I was obeying her illegal order, but because I was sharpening a different kind of tool. The fire I was stoking wasn't in the furnace. It was in the meticulously compiled pages of my file, and it was about to get very, very hot for Karen. A week passed in a tense silence. The certified mail receipt came back with a scrawled signature, confirming the board had received my package. I could almost picture Karen snatching it from the mailman, her face purpling as she read my calm, evidence-based dismantling of her authority. I resisted the urge to fire up the forge, knowing that any action on my part would be twisted and used against me. Patience was the strategy. Let her make the next move. The move came not in the form of a letter, but in the form of whispers and sideways glances. When I took Lily to the community pool, other parents would suddenly find their phone calls very important. A friendly wave to a neighbor across the street was met with a hasty retreat indoors. Karen was poisoning the well, spreading her version of the story. That I was a dangerous rogue, a commercial polluter thumbing his nose at the rules everyone else had to follow. She was turning my quiet, peaceful life into a public spectacle. It was time to start building my own alliances. I knew direct confrontation wouldn't work with most people. They were too afraid of being Karen's next target. I needed to find the others, the ones who had already been on the receiving end of her tyranny. My first stop was the Hendersons, the retired couple next door. George, a retired aerospace engineer, had always been friendly. I found him in his garage, meticulously polishing a classic car. I didn't beat around the bush. "George," I said, "I think you know what's going on with me and the HOA." He stopped polishing and sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I do, Jack, and it's a load of bull. My wife and I can barely hear a thing from your shop, and frankly, we enjoy the sound. It's the sound of something real being made." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Be careful. That woman Karen, she's vindictive. 2 months ago, she tried to fine us, because our garden hose wasn't coiled in a perfect circle. A perfect circle. I had to send her a diagram from a geometry textbook to get her to back off. It was a small thing, absurd and petty, but it was a start. It was a crack in Karen's facade. George's wife, Mary, came out with a pitcher of iced tea. She fined the Patels across the street because their son's basketball hoop was, and I quote, aesthetically displeasing and promoted street loitering. They had to take it down. Their boy was heartbroken. This was the pattern I was looking for. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. It was about her deriving pleasure from bending others to her will. My next visit was more strategic. I looked up the list of past HOA board members from the community website. One name stood out, David Chen, who had served as treasurer for a year before abruptly resigning right after Karen took over. I found his address and paid him a visit. He was a quiet accountant in his late 40s, initially hesitant to talk. But when I laid out my situation and showed him a copy of the letter I'd sent the board, something shifted in his eyes. "She's going to ignore this," he said, tapping my letter, "or she'll bully the other board members into siding with her. That's why I left. I tried to do things by the book, but she operates in a different reality." He invited me inside. His house was immaculate, a testament to his orderly mind. "When I was treasurer," he began, "I noticed irregularities. Small at first. She insisted on using one specific landscaping company, Evergreen Solutions, for all community maintenance, even though their bids were consistently 20% higher than anyone else's. The work was shoddy, too. The sprinklers they installed leak, and they half-killed the cherry trees at the entrance." My ears perked up. "Evergreen Solutions?" I asked. "Do you know who owns it?" David nodded grimly. "Took me some digging. It's registered to a holding company, but the primary agent is a man named Frank Miller, Karen's cousin." The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a power trip, it was a grift. She was using her position to enrich her family at the expense of every homeowner in the community. "I brought it up at a private board meeting," David continued, his voice laced with old frustration. "She accused me of being anti-business and sowing division. The other board members, they're just regular people. They don't want conflict. They folded. I couldn't be a part of it. I resigned the next week." He handed me a stack of papers from his desk. "These are my old notes, copies of the landscaping bids, my analysis of the overcharges. I kept them, just in case. I have a feeling you'll know what to do with them." I left David Chen's house with a folder full of dynamite. My fight was no longer just about my forge. It had expanded. Karen wasn't just a bully, she was corrupt. She was using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. My meticulous binder of evidence was about to get a whole lot thicker. I was no longer just defending my property, I was preparing to liberate a community. My network was small, just a retired engineer and a disillusioned accountant, but it was a start. It was a beachhead. And from this small beachhead, I was going to launch an invasion. The official response from the HOA board arrived a week after I'd met with David Chen. It was exactly what he had predicted. The letter signed by Karen but CC'ing the other 4 board members was a masterwork of bureaucratic condescension. It dismissed my evidence out of hand. My approved plans were outdated and superseded by the new community standards. The fire marshal's report was irrelevant to the aesthetic and noise violations. The sound readings were unverified and likely fabricated. They were not just ignoring my evidence, they were calling me a liar. The letter concluded by informing me that a special hearing had been scheduled in 2 weeks. The purpose of the hearing, it stated, was to review my ongoing violations and consider further punitive actions, up to and including the forced revocation of community privileges and the initiation of foreclosure proceedings for non-payment of fines, which had now ballooned to over $4,000. This was no longer a warning shot, it was a declaration of total war. She wasn't just trying to close my forge anymore. She was trying to take my home. The threat was designed to make me panic, to make me fold. Instead, it sharpened my focus to a razor's edge. I had been trained for this, for moments when the stakes were absolute. You don't panic. You gather intelligence, you analyze, you plan, and you execute. It was time to go on the offensive. My first call was back to David Chen. David, it's Jack Caldwell. She's called a hearing to try and foreclose. I need more than just your notes on the landscaping. I need everything you can remember about her financial dealings. He was quiet for a moment. Jack, this is dangerous. If you go after her finances, she'll come after you with everything. She's already coming after me with everything, I replied, my voice flat and cold. She's trying to take my house. The gloves are off. That was all he needed to hear. He agreed to meet me the next day. My next phase of intelligence gathering was more direct. Using the information from David, I started digging into Evergreen Solutions. A simple business entity search online confirmed Frank Miller, Karen's cousin, as the owner. The business address was a P.O. box, but a deeper search of property records cross-referenced with Frank's name yielded a hit. He owned a small, rundown warehouse in an industrial park on the other side of town. The next morning, I drove out there. What I found was telling. There were no Evergreen Solutions trucks, just one rusty pickup with a flat tire. The warehouse itself was mostly empty, save for a few old lawnmowers and some bags of mulch. This wasn't a legitimate, thriving landscaping company capable of handling a contract for a 200-home subdivision. This was a shell, a front used to funnel HOA money into Karen's family. I took photos from a discreet distance, documenting the state of the company we were all paying a premium for. Next, I went to the county clerk's office. HOA meeting minutes are, in many states, a matter of public record. I filed a formal request for all Summit Creek Estates board meeting minutes for the past 2 years. A week later, I received a thick stack of documents. I spent an entire weekend poring over them, cross-referencing them with David's notes. The pattern was undeniable. Anytime a major expense was discussed, tree trimming, sprinkler repair, mulching the common areas, one board member, a man named Gerald, would propose they get 3 bids. The minutes would then show Karen tabling the discussion. At the next meeting, she would announce that she had proactively solicited bids and that Evergreen Solutions was the most qualified, often without presenting the other bids for comparison. The board, cowed and conflict-averse, would approve it. She wasn't just directing contracts to her cousin, she was actively subverting the HOA's own financial controls. But the real smoking gun was in the fine print. I found the minutes from the meeting where she proposed the new expanded list of violations, the very rules she was using against me. In the appendix of that meeting's packet was a legal review of the new rules, provided by a law firm I'd never heard of. A quick search revealed the firm specialized in real estate law. A further search of the firm's partners revealed something chilling. The lead partner was Karen's brother-in-law. She wasn't just lining her cousin's pockets with landscaping contracts. She was using HOA funds to pay her brother-in-law's firm to draft the very rules she would then use as a weapon against residents. It was a closed loop of corruption, funded entirely by our dues. This was bigger than my forge. This was racketeering, plain and simple. She was using the HOA as a personal fiefdom to enrich her family and punish her enemies. The folder I had started with David Chen's notes was now a bursting 3-ring binder, tabbed and organized with military precision. I had financial records, public documents, photographs, and a clear documented timeline of corruption and abuse of power. The hearing she had called to destroy me was about to become her judgment day. She thought she was the prosecutor, judge, and jury. She had no idea I was about to put her, her family, and her entire corrupt enterprise on trial in front of the whole community. With less than a week until the hearing, my house had become a war room. The dining room table was invisible under a sea of documents, binders, highlighted bylaws, financial statements, meeting minutes, photographs, and legal pads filled with my notes. Sarah, who had initially been terrified, was now my steadfast second in command. She'd seen the evidence I'd uncovered, and her fear had been forged into a cold, hard anger. She spent hours helping me organize the files, her sharp eye catching details I might have missed. "This is insane, Jack," she said one night, holding up a copy of an invoice from Evergreen Solutions. "They charged us $900 to replace 6 sprinkler heads. I could buy them at the hardware store for $10 each." "It's not about the sprinklers," I told her. "It's about the audacity. They do it because they think no one is watching." I knew I couldn't win this fight alone, and I couldn't win it just on paper. I needed a legal expert, someone who could help me navigate the procedural minefield of the hearing and turn Karen's own rules against her. I thought of my old unit. There was a guy I'd served with in Afghanistan, Marcus Thorne. He'd been a JAG officer, a brilliant legal mind with the heart of a pit bull. After leaving the Army, he'd opened a small boutique law firm in the city that specialized in exactly this kind of fight, representing individuals against powerful institutions. I found his firm online and gave him a call. When I said my name, his voice immediately warmed. "Jack Caldwell? You son of a gun. I thought you dropped off the face of the earth. Don't tell me you're finally in trouble." "You have no idea, Marcus," I said, and proceeded to give him the condensed version of the past month. He was silent for a long moment after I finished. A veteran blacksmith being targeted by a corrupt HOA president who is using her position to enrich her family while trying to foreclose on your house, he finally said. "Jack, this isn't a case. This is a gift from the legal gods. I'll clear my schedule. I'm in." He came to the house the next day. Marcus was exactly as I remembered. Sharp suit, sharper mind, and an intensity that made you feel sorry for whoever was on the other side of the table. He spent 4 hours going through my evidence binder, his expression shifting from amusement to professional interest, and finally to a predatory grin. "Jack, this is beautiful," he said, tapping the stack of documents. "You've done 90% of my job for me. This isn't just a solid defense, it's a prosecutorial case file. We're not going into that hearing to defend you. We're going in to depose her, publicly." Our strategy session lasted late into the night. Marcus laid out the plan. We would let Karen present her entire case against me first. We would let her lie, exaggerate, and grandstand. We would sit there and take it, looking weak and defeated. "She needs to feel completely in control," Marcus explained. "Her ego is her greatest weakness. We're going to let her climb as high as she can on her mountain of arrogance. Then when she's at the very peak, we're going to kick the whole mountain out from under her. Our turn to speak would be a methodical, multi-pronged counterattack. I would handle the personal side, the story of my service, my forge as therapy, the approval from the developer, and the technical evidence disproving her claims about noise and fire. Marcus would handle the legal and financial kill shots. He would question her about the bidding process for Evergreen Solutions. He would present the evidence of her familial relationship with the owner. He would bring up the law firm that drafted the rules and its connection to her brother-in-law. He would question the legality of the special hearing itself, arguing it was a retaliatory action, a clear case of tortious interference with my livelihood. The key, Marcus stressed, is to present it not as an attack, but as a series of simple questions. We let the facts speak for themselves. Let the other residents connect the dots. We're not just trying to win your case. We're trying to incite a revolution. The final piece of the strategy was the most important. "You need to get people there, Jack," Marcus said. "A public execution needs an audience. Get George and Mary Henderson. Get David Chen. Get the Patel family whose basketball hoop she took away. Get every single person you can find who has a grievance. Tell them this is their one chance to see justice done." The next few days were a blur of phone calls and quiet front porch meetings. I shared a sanitized version of my plan, enough to give them hope. The fear was still there, but beneath it was a simmering resentment that was ready to boil over. One by one, they agreed to come. They weren't just coming to support me. They were coming for their own piece of vengeance. On the eve of the hearing, my forge was still cold and dark, but my mind was white hot. I had my evidence, I had my lawyer, and I had the beginnings of an army. Karen had called this meeting to be my judge and jury. She had no idea she was walking into her own trial. The trap was set. All we had to do now was wait for the queen to walk into it. The community clubhouse, usually reserved for potlucks and holiday parties, had been transformed into a makeshift tribunal. A long folding table sat at the front of the room, behind which sat Karen and the 4 other board members. Karen was in the center, a large imposing figure in a power red blazer, a stack of papers arranged neatly in front of her. She looked confident, smug even, radiating an aura of absolute control. The other board members, Gerald, the timid one who always suggested getting more bids, a young woman named Brenda who seemed perpetually overwhelmed, and 2 other men who rarely spoke, looked deeply uncomfortable, like hostages at their own execution. The audience was larger than I expected. George and Mary Henderson sat in the front row, their expressions grim and determined. David Chen was a few rows back, clutching a folder of his own. The Patel family was there, along with at least a dozen other homeowners I recognized, all of whom had that same look, a mixture of fear and defiant hope. Sarah sat beside me, her hand resting on my knee, a silent anchor of support. Marcus next to me looked relaxed, almost bored, which I knew meant he was ready for battle. Karen banged a small gavel on the table, a theatrical gesture that was completely unnecessary in the quiet room. This special hearing of the Summit Creek Estates Homeowners Association is now in session, she announced, her voice booming with practiced authority. The agenda for this evening is the continued and egregious violations of community standards by the resident at 112 Oak Hollow Lane, Mr. Jack Caldwell. She spent the next 20 minutes laying out her case. It was a masterful performance of half-truths and outright lies. She held up grainy, zoomed-in photos of my workshop, taken from an angle that made it look menacing and industrial. She read anonymous complaints from concerned neighbors about constant, deafening noise and noxious fumes. Complaints I was certain she had written herself. She painted a picture of me as a rogue industrialist running a dangerous factory in the middle of their peaceful suburb, a man who cared nothing for the safety of their children or the value of their homes. "This is not what Summit Creek is about," she declared, her voice filled with synthetic passion. "We are a community of harmony, of aesthetic beauty, of shared values." Mr. Caldwell's refusal to comply with the simple, common-sense rules that we all live by is a slap in the face to every single one of you who dutifully coils your garden hose, who brings in your trash cans on time, who respects the peace and quiet of your neighbors. She then detailed the fines, which she now claimed totaled over $6,000, and my arrogant refusal to pay them. "The board has been left with no choice," she concluded, her eyes locking onto mine with triumphant malice. "We are here tonight to vote on levying the most serious penalty our bylaws allow, to place a lien on Mr. Caldwell's property and begin foreclosure proceedings to remove this blight from our community." A gasp went through the room. This was it. She had laid her cards on the table. The threat was no longer implied. It was explicit and public. She was trying to make me homeless because she didn't like my workshop. I felt a surge of pure, cold rage, but I remembered Marcus's words. Patience. Let her climb. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Gerald, the timid one, cleared his throat. "Karen, foreclosure seems a bit extreme, doesn't it? Shouldn't we perhaps discuss a compromise?" Karen shot him a look that could curdle milk. "A compromise, Gerald? We do not compromise with those who willfully endanger our community. The time for discussion is over. It's time for a vote." She looked at me, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "However, in the interest of fairness, the board will allow Mr. Caldwell a few minutes to speak, though I can't imagine what he could possibly say to defend this." This was our moment. The stage was set. She thought she was giving me enough rope to hang myself. She had no idea I was about to use it to tie her up in a knot of her own making. I stood up slowly, my binder of evidence in my hand. The room was silent, every eye on me. I took a deep breath. "Thank you, Madam President," I began, my voice even and calm. "I do have a few things to say." I walked to the front of the room and placed my thick binder on a small table facing the board, the thud echoing in the silence. I didn't open it yet. First, I needed to reframe the narrative, to change their perception of who I was. "My name is Jack Caldwell," I started, my voice steady, making eye contact with each board member and then with the faces in the crowd. "Before I was a resident of Summit Creek, I was a sergeant in the United States Army for 15 years. I spent a lot of time in places where rules were the only thing separating order from chaos, and I learned to respect them. I also learned what happens when those rules are twisted by people in power for their own benefit." I let that hang in the air for a second. When I came home, I needed something. Something to quiet the noise. I found it in blacksmithing. The workshop Karen calls a medieval fire pit is my sanctuary. It's where I find peace. It's also my livelihood, how I support my wife and my daughter. I paused, letting my eyes find Sarah and Lily in the crowd. "Karen has presented photos of my workshop. Now, I'd like to present some evidence of my own. I opened the binder. My first exhibit was the large, professionally printed architectural plan for the forge. I held it up for everyone to see. This is the plan for my workshop. As you can see, it was submitted and approved in writing by the developer's Architectural Review Committee before I even broke ground in accordance with Section 7, Paragraph C of the CC and RS. Karen claims this approval is outdated. The bylaws state no such thing. An approval is an approval. Next, I held up the fire marshal's report. Karen claims my forge is a fire hazard. This is the official inspection report from the county fire marshal. It states my workshop not only meets, but significantly exceeds all safety codes, particularly noting the ventilation, fire suppression systems, and non-combustible construction. It is, according to this expert, one of the safest structures of its kind he has ever inspected. I then presented the certified sound readings. Karen read complaints about deafening noise. I hired a certified acoustical engineer to measure the sound from my property line while I was working at peak capacity. The loudest reading he got was 45 decibels. For context, a quiet library is about 40 decibels. The sound of birds chirping in the morning is 50. Her claims are not just an exaggeration, they are a physical impossibility. A murmur went through the crowd. I had just dismantled her entire case in 3 minutes with cold, hard facts. Karen's smug expression was beginning to curdle into a scowl. "This is all irrelevant," she snapped. "The new rules? Let's talk about the new rules," Marcus Thorne said, standing up smoothly. He introduced himself as my legal counsel. "Madam President, my client has just presented evidence that directly refutes the factual basis for every fine you have levied against him. But let's set that aside. I have a few simple procedural questions for the board." He walked to the front, his presence commanding. "My first question is for Mr. Gerald Fleming." Gerald jumped as if he'd been poked with a cattle prod. "Mr. Fleming, the minutes from the May 4th meeting show that you suggested getting 3 bids for the seasonal planting contract. Is that correct?" Gerald swallowed hard, glancing at Karen. Yes, I believe so." "And what was the result of that suggestion?" Marcus pressed. "Well," Gerald stammered, "Karen said she would handle it." "And did she ever present 3 bids to the board for a vote?" "No," Gerald admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "She announced at the next meeting that Evergreen Solutions was the best choice." "Thank you, Mr. Fleming," Marcus said, turning his attention to Karen. "Madam President, is it not true that Evergreen Solutions has been awarded every major landscaping contract for this HOA since you took office, despite their bids often being the highest?" "They do the best work," Karen said defensively, her face flushing. "Is it also not true," Marcus continued, his voice like ice, "that the owner of Evergreen Solutions is a Mr. Frank Miller, who is, in fact, your first cousin?" The room erupted. People gasped, turning to stare at Karen. George Henderson shouted, "So that's it. We've been paying her cousin." Karen was sputtering. "That has no bearing on this. It's a conflict of interest I disclosed." "Really?" Marcus asked, raising an eyebrow. "Because I have a copy of every meeting minute from the last 2 years, and there is no record of any such disclosure." "What there is a record of, however," he said, pulling another document from his briefcase, "is the invoice from the law firm of Smith, Kline and Associates for legal review and drafting of revised community standards. Could you please tell the board what your relationship is to the senior partner, Mr. Robert Kline?" Karen's face went white. He's my brother-in-law." The room was in an uproar. David Chen stood up. "She's been using our money to pay her family. I tried to warn the board about this a year ago." Marcus let the chaos swell for a moment before raising his hand for silence. "So, to summarize," he said, his voice cutting through the noise, "the president has used HOA funds to pay her cousin's uncompetitive company for shoddy work, used HOA funds to pay her brother-in-law's firm to write the very rules she is now using to attack my client, and has done so without disclosing these massive conflicts of interest. This isn't a hearing about Mr. Caldwell's workshop. This is a hearing about the president's abuse of power and potential racketeering." He turned back to me. "Jack, I believe you have one final piece of evidence to present." This was the moment, the kill shot. I looked directly at Karen, whose entire world was collapsing around her. Karen, I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the room, you talk a lot about aesthetic harmony and community values. You put pictures in every newsletter of the beautiful wrought iron gates at the entrance to Summit Creek. You even have a photo on your desk of you posing proudly in front of them. I pulled the final document from my binder. It was a copy of the original invoice from me to the developer for the commission and creation of the Summit Creek Estate's main gates, complete with pictures of the work in progress in my old shop. You hold those gates up as the pinnacle of what this community should be, I said, my voice rising with righteous anger. You use them in every brochure to sell homes and justify your dues. So I just have one question for you. I held up the invoice for the entire room to see. If my work is such a blight on this community, why are you so proud of the masterpiece I built at our front door? The silence in the room was absolute, a perfect, hollow vacuum where Karen's authority used to be. Every eye was on the invoice in my hand, then on my face, then on Karen's, which had cycled through a spectrum of crimson and was now settling on a pale, waxy white. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost a physical presence in the room. The very symbol of her prestigious community, the centerpiece of her marketing, the object she used to justify her entire reign, was the product of the man she was trying to destroy. She had built her castle on my foundation, and I had just pulled it out from under her. A low chuckle started from the back of the room. It was George Henderson. It grew into a full-throated laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated catharsis. Then Mary joined in, then the Patels, and soon half the room was filled with laughter. It wasn't mocking laughter. It was the laughter of liberation, the sound of a spell being broken. They weren't laughing at her as much as they were laughing at the sheer, beautiful absurdity of her downfall. Karen just sat there frozen, the papers in front of her suddenly looking like a pile of meaningless trash. Her red blazer, meant to project power, now just looked garish and desperate. That's a lie, she finally stammered, her voice a weak, pathetic squeak. You're lying. Marcus stepped forward, his expression cold. Are we, Madam President? Because not only do we have the invoice, we have a sworn affidavit from the developer, Mr. Thompson, confirming that he personally commissioned Mr. Caldwell to create the gates and that he considers them a work of art. He also confirms that he personally approved the plans for Mr. Caldwell's workshop. Would you like me to read his statement into the record? He didn't need to. The damage was done. The other board members were staring at Karen with open horror. They weren't just complicit in her petty tyranny anymore. They were potentially on the hook for her financial malfeasance. Brenda, the young, overwhelmed board member, was the first to crack. I had no idea, she said, her voice trembling as she addressed the room. She told us the bids were competitive. She told us the legal review was standard procedure. I never would have voted for any of this if I had known. Gerald, emboldened, found his spine. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the president, he announced, his voice shaking but firm. And I second that, a man from the audience shouted. All in favor of removing Karen Peterson as president of the HOA, say aye. A deafening roar of "Aye" filled the room. It was a tidal wave of pent-up frustration and anger unleashed. All opposed? Marcus asked into the silence that followed. Only one sound was heard. Karen, who whispered a pathetic nay that was swallowed by the ringing silence. The motion carries, Gerald said, looking stunned by his own actions. Karen, you are no longer president. It was at this moment that Karen finally completely imploded. The carefully constructed facade of the competent, authoritative community leader shattered, revealing the screeching, entitled creature beneath. You can't do this, she shrieked, slamming her fists on the table, scattering her useless papers. I am this community. I built this. You are all ungrateful, worthless peons. You'll be sorry. This place will turn into a slum without me. She pointed a trembling, sausage-like finger at me. And you and your filthy, noisy fire pit. I will sue you. I will ruin you. You haven't heard the last of me. Marcus stepped calmly between us. Actually, I think we have. Karen Peterson, please be advised that as of this moment, you are being put on notice. We will be filing a civil suit against you on behalf of Mr. Caldwell for harassment, defamation, and tortious interference. Furthermore, this entire evidence file," he said, patting my binder, "will be turned over to the district attorney's office tomorrow morning for a criminal investigation into fraud and embezzlement. I suggest you retain counsel, not your brother-in-law." The mention of the district attorney finally silenced her. The color drained from her face, replaced by the stark gray pallor of genuine fear. Her reign of terror, her corrupt little empire, had been dismantled in less than an hour, not with a sledgehammer, but with facts, figures, and one beautifully ironic invoice. Security, which Karen herself had insisted on hiring for the meeting in case Mr. Caldwell became unruly, now stood uncertainly by the door. The newly minted acting president, Gerald, looked at them. "Please escort Ms. Peterson from the premises." As the two guards gently but firmly took her by the arms, she had one last parting shot. She looked at the community she had terrorized, the people who had just overthrown her, and with a voice dripping with venom, she said, "I hope your property values plummet." It was the only weapon she had left, and it fell completely flat. No one cared. They were too busy breathing free air for the first time in years. As she was led out of the clubhouse, a disgraced queen being exiled from her own imaginary kingdom, I felt not triumph, but a quiet, profound sense of justice. The fire she had started had indeed consumed something. It had burned away the rot, the corruption, and the fear, leaving behind a community ready to rebuild. The aftermath of the hearing was swift and decisive. With Karen gone, the remaining board members, led by a surprisingly resolute Gerald, went into immediate damage control. Their first official act at an emergency session the following day was to unanimously vote to dismiss all fines and violations against me. They issued a formal letter of apology, acknowledging the validity of my pre-approved plans and recognizing my forge not as a violation, but as an asset to the community's artistic character. The second act was to terminate the contract with Evergreen Solutions, effective immediately. David Chen was unanimously voted back onto the board to fill the vacancy left by Karen and was immediately tasked with heading up a new finance committee to conduct a full audit of the last 2 years of spending. The third act, prompted by a firm letter from Marcus, was to fire Karen's brother-in-law's law firm and place a stop payment on their most recent outrageous invoice. A new, local, and thoroughly vetted firm was hired to represent the HOA's actual interests. Marcus, true to his word, compiled our evidence and delivered it to the district attorney's office. A few weeks later, we learned that the DA had opened a formal criminal investigation into Karen for embezzlement and fraud. Her little kingdom of kickbacks had attracted the attention of a much higher power. Her cousin Frank's sham company evaporated overnight, and we heard through the grapevine that he was cooperating with investigators in exchange for leniency. Karen's downfall was total. She became a pariah. The same neighbors who once feared her now openly ignored her. Her house, once the command center of her petty tyranny, now looked like a besieged fortress with the blinds constantly drawn. A for sale sign appeared on her lawn less than a month after the hearing. The irony was, in her final, desperate attempt to sell, her own real estate agent used photos of the main gates, my gates, as the primary selling point in the online listing. The house sold quickly, and she was gone, a bad memory fading in the rear-view mirror of a moving truck. The community began to heal. The atmosphere changed almost overnight. People started talking to each other again. Lawn decorations, long hidden in garages for fear of being sighted, began to reappear. The Patel's son got a brand new basketball hoop, and the sound of him playing in his driveway became a joyful part of the neighborhood's soundtrack. George and Mary Henderson hosted a neighborhood barbecue to celebrate the Great Liberation, as George called it. It was the first community gathering in years that felt genuinely happy and relaxed. I fired up my forge for the first time in over a month. The familiar roar of the propane, the ringing of the anvil, the scent of hot steel. It was like taking a deep breath after being underwater for too long. Instead of sideways glances, I got waves and thumbs ups. Neighbors I'd never even spoken to stopped by, not to complain, but to ask what I was making. Their curiosity genuine. A few even commissioned small pieces, house numbers, a garden stake, a simple wall hook. My business, which Karen had tried to extinguish, was now being nurtured by the very community she claimed to be protecting. A few months later, the new HOA board approached me with a proposal. The audit had revealed the extent of Evergreen Solutions' neglect. The beautiful cherry trees near the entrance were dying, the irrigation was a mess, and the gates, my gates, were showing signs of rust where the cheap paint applied by Karen's cousin's crew was peeling away. The audit also revealed, Gerald said a bit sheepishly, that we actually have a healthy surplus in the maintenance fund, now that we're not overpaying for everything. We were wondering, Jack, if you would be willing to accept a commission from the HOA to fully restore the front gates. Strip them down, treat them properly, and make them look the way they were intended to. He handed me a proposed contract. The figure was more than fair. It was generous. It was the community's way of making things right, of investing in the very craftsmanship Karen had tried to ban. The symbolism was perfect. I accepted immediately. The final confrontation was quiet and deeply satisfying. I spent a week working on the gates, not at my shop, but on site, right at the entrance to the community. I stripped away the shoddy paint, treated the emerging rust, and applied a deep, multi-layered finish that would protect the iron for decades. As I was putting the final touches on the scrollwork, a moving truck rumbled past me, leaving the community. Behind the wheel of the car following it was Karen, her face a mask of bitter resentment. She had to drive right past me, had to see me there, lovingly restoring the masterpiece she had tried to use as a weapon against its own creator. Our eyes met for a fleeting second. I didn't smile or gloat. I just gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a nod that said, "I'm still here. I'm still building, and you're gone." It was a victory not of anger, but of endurance. She hit the gas and disappeared down the road, forever. That evening I stood back and looked at the restored gates, gleaming in the sunset. Lily ran up and took my hand. "You fixed them, Daddy." "Yes, I did," I said, squeezing her hand. I wasn't just talking about the gates. We had fixed the community. We had taken something that was being twisted by rust and corruption and restored it to its original strength and beauty. I went back to my forge, my sanctuary, now fully and openly embraced by my neighbors. The fire was roaring, a piece of steel was glowing, ready to be shaped. The rhythmic, honest sound of my hammer striking the anvil echoed into the peaceful night. No longer a source of conflict, but a symbol of resilience, a testament to the fact that integrity, like well-forged steel, will always endure.